Hello all, welcome to the second video on Voltaire's Candide. In the previous video, we managed to introduce the context behind the writing of Candide. We managed to introduce the writer, to talk about the religious background, which is the idea of optimism per se, and we also talked about the genre of Candide. Now, in this video, we are going to focus on the text itself, i.e., we are going to look at certain parts in the text to be able to explain how Voltaire is trying to criticize the philosophy of optimism throughout his novella. Before we start looking at specific parts in the text, I would like to talk about Voltaire's writing style in Candide in general, where actually his own attack on the ideas of Leibniz and Pope was not limited to matters of content only, but his very style of writing is an assault upon what he saw as their self-deluding optimism. Much has been written about his own style, its alacrity, its bounce, the speed of its transitions, and these qualities so appropriate for describing travel are put to good use in Candide. However, of course, we will not be able to analyze the idiosyncrasy of Voltaire's writing style in Candide because we are referring to a translation from French into English, but still it is very clear how clever he is and how intelligent he is in using language to convey the ideas, specifically his own critical ideas against the philosophy of optimism. Voltaire's target is not just the illusion fed by a particular school of philosophy, but the sort of moral dishonesty present in most ages that flinches away from the facts. In 18th century English, there was a term for such well-meaning linguistic avoidance, and it was called cant. This is the word here. So it was called cant, a word that had its origin in the Italian verb to sing, but which had come to mean the whining of a beggar, or by extension, all manner of humbug. For Voltaire, it was the enemy because it led people to deceive others, and often also to deceive themselves. His view was that to write or speak simply and directly is usually to write or speak well. Now let's start by digging into the female narrators in Candide. Now, as we said before, that females were always represented as being the silent subaltern in most of the novels, really throughout, the history of English literature. It was something new, I would rather say an anomaly on the part of Voltaire, to make females narrate their own stories. It is usually referred to as history, his story, but here it is going to be her story. It is going to be the story of the female narrators. In Candide, we see three major female narrators. Of course, the most important one would be Cunegonde, Candide's beloved, who retells the events of the opening chapters from her perspective, because of course we know that the events were already being told by Dr. Ralph, who is the naive narrator, as explained earlier in the previous video. And then we have chapters 11 and 12 narrated by the old woman, who tells Cunegonde the story of her life, and the first part of chapter 24, which is narrated by Paquet. However, we are only going to focus on Cunegonde and the old woman for the sake of the chapters here. So this basically means that in these episodes, told from a feminine perspective, Voltaire is giving us history from the point of view of its victim. Yes, history from the point of view of its victims, and this is regarded as something new, but as well it is not really weird because of the background information we knew about Voltaire himself being a political activist who is always standing with the rights of people, notwithstanding the rights of the victims. In these three episodes, Voltaire satirizes the creed of Pope and Leibniz. Of course, Pangloss's cheerful apathy, which is exposed as an overwhelmingly masculine delusion by the blunt facts of female subservience in a male-dominated society. All three women will tell tales of spectacular suffering and misadventure, which are nonetheless lighted by their transparent absurdities and extravagant hyperbole. So let's start with the character of Cunegonde, who is regarded as the most important of the female characters in Candide. In terms of the plot, much of Candide's journeying is in search of Cunegonde, but her name warns us that she's no princess in a fairy tale rescued by a brave prince, and nor is she a sentimental heroine in a conventional 18th century novel. Her name basically derives from the chaste wife of Henry II and compounds explicit sexual references, which are exploited throughout the novel for a variety of comic effects. Aside from its comic effects, Cunegonde's name discloses Voltaire's concern in Candide to promote the quality of candor. And the word condor here is in total opposite of the word cont, which was introduced to you a minute ago. And the word candor is the quality of being open and frank. Voltaire's reliance on associations conjured up by her name is in keeping with her own frankness about the body. Also, it is suggested that during the course of her tribulations, Cunegonde has sometimes been reduced to a sexual plaything. As we said, these two chapters, chapters 8 and 9, introduce Cunegonde's story. And of course, we already know the story of Cunegonde because it was previously narrated by our naive narrator, Dr. Ralph. But here, the story is being retold by Cunegonde herself. Of course, there is a major difference here between how a woman narrates her own story and how a man, and specifically a very naive man like Dr. Ralph, would be narrating the oppression and would be narrating the suffering that Cunegonde has gone through, which really makes these two chapters extremely important in Voltaire's ideas of representing the subaltern figure, or representing here the female character as a person, a human being with flesh and bone who has certain emotions and feelings that she would want to express, in a candor way, in a very honest way to the audience. So if you just read the opening of this chapter here, chapter 8, you would figure out that the story is being told from a feminine point of view. She recounts her story in Lisbon, which gives Voltaire a chance to portray the injustices meted out in this traditionalist Catholic society on four minorities: women, Protestants, intellectuals, and Jews. Her own candor is also directed at Voltaire's philosophical targets, and in direct contrast, of course, to Dr. Ralph, Cunegonde concludes from her awful experiences that Pangloss is utterly wrong. Pangloss is the representative or the spokesman for optimism in this novella, and therefore Voltaire would never stop, would never cease to make fun, of his own ideas. She says Pangloss deceived me cruelly, after all, when he told me that all is for the best in this. The second female character we will be discussing here is the old woman. And you can look at her story on pages 27 and 28. And she's going to explain in the story that she was a princess, and then she was about to get married to a prince, but he died. And then she was taken along with her mother on a ship, and they were turned into slaves and prostitutes. It was just a horrible story. And inside the story, we will understand that women were really oppressed, in such a society. But of course, Voltaire, thanks to Voltaire, they were allowed to express their worries and express their own feelings, in Candide. The slave, the Dutch slave. This is such a heart-breaking scene when Candide is going to meet a Dutch slave in Suriname, and he's going to talk with him. Now, this is part of, their own conversation. "Yes, sir," said the Negro, "it is the custom. They give us a pair of linen drawers for our whole garment twice a year. When we work at the sugar canes and the mill snatches hold of a finger, they cut off the hand, and when we attempt to run away, they cut off the leg. Both cases have happened to me. This is the price at which you eat sugar in Europe. Yet when my mother sold me for 10 paragons on the coast of Genoa, she said to me, 'My dear child, bless our fetishes, adore them forever. They will make thee live happily. Thou hast the honor of being the slave of our lords, the whites, which is making the fortune of thy father and mother. Alas, I know not whether I have made their fortunes. This I know, that they have not made mine. Dogs, monkeys, and parrots are 1,000 times less wretched than I. The Dutch fetishes who have caviared me declare every Sunday that we are all of us children of Adam, blacks as well as whites. I am not a genealogist, but if these preachers tell truth, we are all second cousins. Now you must agree that it is impossible to treat one's relations in a more barbarous manner. O Pangloss, cried Candide, thou hadst not guessed at this abomination. It is the end. I must at last renounce thy optimism. What is this optimism? Said Cacambo. Alas, said Candide, it is the madness of maintaining that everything is right when it is wrong. Now we understand from this encounter with the slave that the slave is recounting his sufferings, that he tried to escape. That is why they cut off one leg and his finger was caught in the sugar mill. That is why they cut off, an entire hand. It's such a horrible, heartbreaking situation here. The slave's African mother and his Dutch owner both benefit by his enslavement, but the slave declares himself to be 1,000 times more miserable than dogs, monkeys, and parrots. The impact of the encounter with the slave upon Candide is profound as he cries, "O Pangloss, this is one abomination you could not have anticipated, and I fear it has finally done for me. I am given up on your optimism after all." The Dutch slave is regarded to be one of the major turning points in Candide's way of thinking, because after having this encounter, Candide started to denounce his belief in optimism, which has been implanted by him by his teacher Pangloss from the beginning of the story. Voltaire's tone here seems to be very, very serious in order to express unequivocally how much he loathes and abominates slavery. The female characters, as well as the Dutch slave in Suriname, are not the slightest bit delicate when it comes to telling people about the cruelties, perversities, and humiliations that have been their lot. They tell their histories throughout the unflinching honesty and candor. Now let's move to Candide's journey to El Dorado with Cacambo. As we said, if you look at the map at the beginning of the book, you will figure out that all the journey that Candide has undertaken includes real cities. So you have Lisbon, you have Constantinople, you have Paris, you have Suriname. Now, all of these cities are real cities, with the exception of just one city, which is the city of El Dorado, which is regarded as a mythical, city. In El Dorado, Cacambo translates all the exchanges with El Dorado's inhabitants for Candide. The word El Dorado literally means the man of gold. By the 16th century, however, it had come to refer to something else, a legendary country in the far hinterland of South America where gold was as common as any rock. But of course, this is not true. It's a legendary country. We now know this place to have been utterly mythical and its seekers to have been deluded. But it is not difficult to see how this opulent fairyland had welled up from the Western imagination. In the 16th and 17th centuries, many galleons laden with artifacts had made their way eastwards across the Atlantic towards Spain or Portugal, leading people to suppose this story was real. In the 18th century, the myth was not quite dead. This chapter amounts to a critique of value. Now, what happens is in El Dorado is as follows. Please have a read, to this specific chapter here. Candide and Cacambo have a conversation with an old man who we figure out is 125 years old. His house is full of gold. Everything is built from gold and silver. All right, he keeps asking this old man about the religion, about priests, and about the church. When the old man would answer that they just love God and they don't ask God for anything, they just, thank Him unceasingly for all all, the things that he has given them. They do not have priests or anything in the church. All of them are the same. And then Candide and Cacambo would go and visit, the king himself. And Cacambo would ask about the way, in which they have to treat the king. And actually, they say that you have to greet the king by just hugging him and kissing him. Now, this was really weird for a person like Candide, who comes from a world where everything is horrible, from a dystopian world, to be more precise. So this chapter has really two main, messages to deliver. The first thing is that it becomes a critique of value, in which the ethical and material standards of the visitors are played off against those of their hosts. So as we said, the old man lives in a modest house, the door of which is merely of silver and the paneling in the apartment merely of gold. And they actually call it a modest house, like a humble house made of silver and gold, which is really weird. This sounds like irony, because it is only in the eyes of the reader and of Candide and Cacambo, to the old man the house really is modest, but it's only for the man that the house is really modest, because it seems here that gold and silver are, very mainstream, and they are there everywhere. And therefore, when something is there, the supply of it is really great, everybody has it, then it basically, loses its own. Those who live in this earthly paradise are quite unaware of this fact, though they are also conscious of the unseemly and irrational effects that rumors of their land have had on the minds of outsiders. The effect from the reader's point of view is to bring into question the subject of value. Candide and Cacambo, at the end of the El Dorado encounter, they actually decide to leave. All right. So Candide talked to Cacambo, and he said, "Well, I know that this is a wonderful place. This is a heavenly place. This is more or less a utopia, but I need to go. If we take a lot of pebbles, this is how they call gold in El Dorado. If we take a lot of gold from them, I think it was a dozen sheep filled with gold. If we take all of this and we go back to our world, we are going to be richer than all the kings, and we can find Cunegonde, and we will live happily ever after." But of course, it was really funny, because after that, after they decided to leave, after taking the pebbles, they lost most of, the gold. Some of them were stolen, some of them were lost, but eventually they did not have all this amount of gold. Candide and Cacambo are subliminally aware of the unreality of the place they have stumbled upon, and are soon anxious to leave it. They head for the smoke and the stress. Now, the fact that they decide to leave would reflect the idea that man is very greedy. He wants everything. He wants to be distinguished. He wants to be different from other people. They believe that if they stay here and they have all this amount of money, all this amount of gold, they are going to be equal to everybody else. And it seems here that man is very greedy, to the extent that he doesn't want to be equal like everybody else. He wants to be different. He wants to be distinguished. And that is why Candide and Cacambo decided to leave this heavenly place and live, go back to the old world where everybody is suffering, So they decided to leave utopia in order to live in a dystopia. Now, there is, as we said, a cynical reason for their departure. The untold wealth around them is as valueless to them as it is to the native people, as long as it remains where it is. If, like the Spanish before them, they can arrange to take it away, the situation would be very different. Candide declares that if they leave El Dorado, we shall be richer than all the kings here, than all the kings put together. We shall no longer have inquisitors to fear, and we shall easily rescue Cunegonde. According to the narrator, Cacambo was persuaded by Candide's argument, and so they arranged to have some sheep loaded up with gold and are winched across the mountains to the world beyond. The implication of Candide's and Cacambo's experience of El Dorado is that there are plenty of worlds that are better, they are just unrealizable. This then is utopia, a perfect or a non-existent place. Now let's move to the final parts of the story here, wherein Candide, Cacambo, Pangloss, Cunegonde, and the old woman would decide to live in the east, specifically in Constantinople in Turkey. And here I will have to introduce one major idea, the idea of fate or destin, which was introduced in Voltaire's philosophical dictionary. And of course, the idea of fate would be so much different from the idea in the East, according to Voltaire, than fate, in the West. In his dictionary, which is on page 116, 117, he actually says, obedient to the dictionary convention of beginning with classical precedents, Voltaire opens his entry with a discussion of how Homer understood the meaning of fate. Modern philosophers, he continues, agree that all events are governed by immutable laws, and he proceeds to give several examples of how the strict application of this axiom leads to absurd conclusions. With heavy irony, he then discloses his own view by quoting first unnamed idiots who say that my doctor saved my aunt from a fatal illness, he made her live 10 years. Now, Edward Said is a very, very famous Palestinian American scholar, and he argues in his well known study, Orientalism, published in 1978, that during the centuries when the culture of the West had predatory designs on the lands of the East, a belief in Oriental passivity and fatalism served as a useful adjunct to these plans of acquisition. Peoples who were temperamentally pessimistic were, it was inferred, easily dominated by their own rulers or by outsiders. In the West, it was supposed men and women were more likely to believe in freedom of choice and were therefore more inclined to resist tyranny. So this is how the East, the West really sees us, as people who believe in fate, which really means that if you're going to die, then don't go to the doctor to be saved because it's your fate to die. This is basically how Pangloss was really referring to optimism at the beginning. And therefore, Voltaire's decision to end the story in the East would somehow make us conjecture that for him, the East would believe in fate, i.e., that they believe that they should not resist any kind of external forces if anything is really, taking place with them and with their countries. In chapter 3, we will meet two more people. We will meet the dervish, all right, and then we will meet another old man, and then we will understand from these two final encounters how Voltaire decided to end his own story. Now, when Candide and Cacambo in chapter 3, no, I'm sorry, Pangloss, Candide and Pangloss in chapter 30, the last chapter of the novella, would go and visit the dervish to ask him about what was happening, all right, the attitude was a bit different, was a bit weird and awkward from the dervish. Now, the dervish philosopher is great, but mainly in the eyes of his disciples. He's quite detached from the world, and he advises Candide and his band to withdraw from the world too. In reply to Pangloss's question, so what must we do? He says, keep your mouth shut. The interview concludes with the dervish philosopher slamming the door in Pangloss's. As for the old man, it's more or less the same philosophy, but he explained this philosophy in a better attitude. The old man on the farm expressed a detached attitude towards the machinations of powerful people in the big city. I never inquire about what goes on in Constantinople, he declares. But if both these machinations and his indifference to them are predestined, who are Candide and Pangloss to object? As a matter of fact, they do not object, but they retire to their own garden and do likewise. Pangloss considers everything that has happened to be confirmation of his creed, even though the disappointments he and his companions have endured contradict it. Pangloss's last statement is a triumphant reassertion of his belief system to which he has remained true through all manner of adversity. But notice that Candide makes no attempt to contradict him. Instead, he remarks, "This is well said," before going on to express his own hard-won pragmatic nostrum, but we must cultivate our. In this last chapter of Candide, Voltaire is therefore trying to see the idea of destiny from several points of view. These include not only different schools of philosophy, but also the perspectives on this common problem adopted by different cultures, both Eastern and Western. Now, we need to think whether the finale of the novella itself means that both Candide and Pangloss have succumbed to Eastern fatalism, Or have Candide and his companions found minimal fulfillment at last, or have they simply stopped trying, something that Voltaire himself never did? These are paradoxes that Voltaire quite deliberately refrains from solving for us. As Voltaire very well knows, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot believe in freedom and fate at the same time, or can you? Can you believe in fate and freedom at the same time? This is really something that you need to think of. As far as the ending is concerned, we shouldn't ignore the possibility that at a practical level, Voltaire was commending gardening as a therapeutic solace. Gardens are pleasant places, and Voltaire was fond of his own. Another world very familiar to Voltaire, which is described in Candide with much less affection, is that of books and publishing. For Voltaire, the candid response, it seems, is to work or sit in your garden with a book or without one. This was the end of the presentation wherein we looked at some of the parts, some texts relating to Voltaire, and we managed to understand what Voltaire really wanted to convey through his own novella by giving voices to the voiceless, to the weak, um, entities in history, and of course by criticizing the philosophy of optimism. I hope you understood that. Thank you so much for listening.